Good afternoon. We have general questions. Question number 1, Richard Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on progress with the procurement process and construction of the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route.
Minister Keith Brown.
Procurement for the main works contract is progressing well. Overall, the programme remains as set out by the First Minister in October 2012, with the award of the contract expected later this year and construction completed by spring 2018.
Richard Baker.
Thank you. Over the Christmas recess, the Minister said sections of the AWPR could be open early, before spring 2018. Can he tell us if ministers have specific plans to open sections of the road early, and which sections they would be? Would they be in the north or south of the route? And whether the pursuit of such plans is forming any part of the procurement of the contract?
Minister.
What we said previously was, of course, that the idea of bringing forward certain sections, 2 sections which have been mentioned, have been Balmedy to Tipperty and obviously at the road around the airport. That could not be considered until we had received the bids, because it would have to be done in conjunction with the bidding process and the successful contract. But that remains the case, and we will look at not only whether we can advance certain parts of the contract, but what the implications of that would be for other parts of the road as well. So we'll take a balanced view on this, but it can't be done until we have the process of the bids coming forward, and we'll look at it in detail at that stage.
Question 2, Malcolm Chisholm.
To ask the Scottish Government what support it can give to the campaign for a Leith museum.
Minister Hamza Yousaf.
The Scottish Government provides support for non-national museums through Museums Galleries Scotland, the National Development Agency for Museums and Galleries in Scotland. However, in this instance, I understand that the Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs has agreed to meet with you and your colleagues to discuss the campaign for a Leith museum.
Thank the Minister, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for agreeing to the meeting. But does the Minister know of the great and growing support in Leith for the creation of a Leith museum, and of the unanimous view that the A-listed Custom House would be the ideal location? Given that Museums Scotland will vacate the building quite soon, will he and the Cabinet Secretary ensure that the building is designated in the first instance for acquisition by the community rather than sale to a developer?
Minister.
I thank the member for the supplementary question, and also, of course, we acknowledge the important role the community is playing in this respect, and the local interest in Leith Museum and the potential for bringing a building like Leith Customs House back into public use. I'm sure the member appreciates that the Scottish Government and its public bodies are obliged by the Scottish Public Finance Manual rules set to seek best value for the disposal of property. But options for disposal other than the open market are available, but they are limited. But I think it would be helpful to discuss this when the member meets with the Cabinet Secretary in the near future.
Question 3, Sandra White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the inquiry by the UK Parliament's Public Administration Select Committee on the impartiality of civil servants in relation to the independence referendum.
Cabinet Secretary Nicola Sturgeon.
We welcome the inquiry. It provides the opportunity to affirm both the commitment of the Scottish Government to the principles which underpin the operation of the civil service, the principles of impartiality, integrity, objectivity and honesty, and also the record of the civil service in Scotland in upholding those values. I'm pleased also that the committee is to examine the role of the civil service in support of the UK Government's position in constitutional reform in Scotland. I think it will be important for the committee to ensure that consistent standards are applied across both administrations.
Sandra White.
Thank you. I thank the Deputy First Minister for that reply, and do agree that any review should not single out one part of the civil service. Does the Deputy First Minister also agree that it is the proper role of the Scottish Government civil service to support Scottish Ministers' policies for constitutional reform?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I do agree with that, and I would imagine that all Democrats would agree with that position. This administration stood for election on a platform of supporting a referendum and of supporting independence, and it's absolutely appropriate for the civil service to support Scottish ministers in delivering those policies, just as the civil service would support any other government in developing and implementing their policies. It's also worth pointing out that any complaint that has been made about the Scottish civil service has been found to be unsubstantiated. Indeed, successive heads of the UK civil service have publicly acknowledged that it is the duty of the Scottish Government civil service to support this government's policies for the Constitution.
Malcolm Chisholm.
I've always supported Scottish civil servants, even when they have been under attack by certain people, but equally will she therefore make sure that none of her colleagues criticise the UK civil service, and particularly in this connection the Permanent Secretary to the Treasurer?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as I said in my original answer, I think it's good, and I support the fact that the UK Parliament Public Administration Select Committee is going to examine the role of the civil service, not just in supporting the Scottish Government, but also in its support of the UK Government's position on constitutional reform. It is important that the committee looks at both, and that there are consistent standards applied to both governments in terms of the pursuit of their policies in the referendum. So my comments about the civil service in Scotland apply generally, and I hope this committee helps to get us to a position in advance of the referendum where the impartiality of the civil service is absolutely beyond any doubt.
Question number 4, Christian Allard.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it plans to meet elected representatives from France, and if so, when.
Minister Hamza Yousaf.
The Cabinet Secretary for Culture and External Affairs will meet with the French MP Axel Lemaire, a member of the French second elected chamber, Senator Claudine Lepage, on Tuesday, the 11th of March.
Christian Allard.
I thank the Minister for his answer. The eyes of the world are upon us. Would the Minister agree with the French Senatrix Mrs Garriott-Mellem, who made clear in a debate last week on Scotland's future that the threats formulated by Mr Barroso are inappropriate and the result of pressure from London? Mrs Garriott-Mellem added that those threats were not credible, and a yes vote will ensure that Scotland stays in the European Union.
Minister.
The Scottish Government has always been clear that an independent Scotland would negotiate its continued membership from within the EU. Mrs Garriott-Mellem's comments were, of course, a welcome recognition of that point, as were the former Czech President Václav Klaus' comments that were reported in the Herald on the 1st of March, and indeed Professor Charlie Jeffrey, Professor of Politics at Edinburgh University, in a written submission to the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee this month, who has also said, and I quote, "Barroso's was a personal, not a commission statement made by an outgoing Commission President with no influence on what might happen in the event of a yes vote on a matter where this is neither treaty provision nor precedent." We hope by the time that the rest of the UK, of course, has its in-out referendum on the EU, it too will choose to continue its membership with the European Union.
Question number 5, Jimmy McGrigor. Mr.
To ask the Scottish Government what steps it is taking to prevent further closures of the A83 because of landslips.
Minister Keith Brown.
The Scottish Government, working closely with our stakeholder partners, has already invested nearly £7.5 million on the A83 around the Rest and Be Thankful, which is a clear sign of our intent to find solutions to keep the A83 open and operational. Presiding Officer, the Old Military Road diversion is currently in use as we speak, which is a clear example of this Government's efforts. The A83 route study recommended actions to address landslide hazards at other locations, in particular Glenkinglass, Cairndow and Loch Shira, to give a comparable level of landslide protection to that proposed at the Rest and Be Thankful. We progressed investigations at all 3 sites, and the output of that will be a report recommending areas within each site which are considered high risk, together with potential mitigation options. Following this morning's closure and representations I have received from the local constituency member Mike Russell, I have asked for members of the 83 task force to come together within the next fortnight to take forward some of the plans that we have in that area.
Jimmy McGrigor.
Well, I thank the Minister for that, and I welcome the fact that the old military road is being used for today's landslide. Can he say, does he understand the frustration of local businesses and residents that more than 2 years on, we are still at the stage of only having draft options for the other locations, and what can be done to get practical solutions? And lastly, will he consider his position on conducting a study into the economic impact of these closures, because every business in Argyll and Bute, from Candu to Campbelltown and Dunoon and Cowell, suffer each time this road is closed?
Minister.
Can I say, yes, I am very well aware of the frustration which is caused, and unlike the member, I have attended all the meetings of the task force group where these issues have been discussed in some depth. And I have to say that I have to say that the members of that task force, which include many of the businesses which the member refers to, have made these points, are also keen to make sure that the reports which are out in the media are accurate, because obviously they don't want to have the impression, which is not the case, that Argyll is closed for business. And I think if you look at what's happened today, by investing on the old military road, we have a resilience programme in place which has allowed the closure to be very brief and to allow traffic to move very quickly. That's the kind of things, the action which we've been asked to take forward by the stakeholders. I am aware of the frustration, and we're doing as much as we can do to mitigate that, and will continue to do that in future years in terms of the other areas I've talked about.
Question number 6, Duncan McNeill.
To ask the Scottish Government when the Cabinet Secretary for Health last met with the Chief Executive of NHS Glasgow Clyde and what was discussed.
Cabinet Secretary Alex Neil.
Presiding Officer, ministers and officials regularly meet with representatives of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, including the Chief Executive, to discuss matters of importance to local people.
Duncan McNeill.
I hope the Cabinet Secretary thinks this is a matter of importance. In response to my Freedom of Information request, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde confirmed that they do not have any systems in place to monitor the number of times patients with dementia are boarded when in hospital. Indeed, this response has often been reflected by a number of other health boards in Scotland. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that boarding can increase dementia patients' confusion, make them more ill and lead to longer stays in hospital. Does the Cabinet Secretary not agree that keeping track of dementia patients' bed moves is vital for their well-being, and will he act along with the health boards to ensure monitoring systems are put in place as soon as possible?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as the member will be aware, we published a report last year on the whole issue of boarding, along with the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh and a number of other key stakeholders, and that agreed a strategy for dealing with boarding in the future. And part of that, and the key part of that, of course, in the first place, is to reduce the need for boarding for any patient, including dementia patients. I do appreciate that any change of circumstance for a dementia patient is particularly difficult for that patient, and the policy of the Health Service is to minimise any disruption for dementia patients in particular, and we are looking at the whole situation to see how further improvements can be made on the wider issue of boarding, as well as the specific issue of treating dementia patients.
Question number 7, in the name of Jackie Bailey, has not been lodged. The member has provided to me a full explanation, and I am satisfied. Question number 8, Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what progress it is making in reducing the transmission and access charges to the grid for marine and islands renewable energy.
Minister Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, last week I chaired an Island Electricity Grid Summit in Stornoway alongside Council leaders from Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles. It was evident from the discussions that progress has been made towards establishing market and regulatory frameworks that can support Ireland's renewables development.
Rob Gibson.
Thank the Minister for his answer. I wonder if he would consider what chance there is of Westminster ceding powers to Holyrood to regulate energy production over our substantial marine and island renewable prospects in, for example, my constituency at the Pentland Firth in the Northern and Western Isles, so as to give us a greater means to tackle the increasingly urgent evidence of climate change and give certainty to the supply chain.
Minister Fergus Ewing.
Well, I'm not aware of any proposals from the UK Government or any opposition party to devolve plans for regulatory powers to this Parliament. Only independents, Presiding Officer, can do that. It's important to recognise that in the islands, Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles, they're the best place in the world to do renewable energy. And they can deliver, according to an expert report, up to 5% of the electricity needs by 2030 of the whole of the GB. But there are difficulties, and I can only best quote these from Martin McAdam, CEO of Aquamarine, who says, "There are worrying parallels with the UK's early history in wind technology, where the UK had an early lead, but a succession of poor policy measures handed the lead to Denmark. I would encourage the UK Government to be more bold, to recognise the economic opportunity which exists and to work alongside the Scottish Government to implement island-specific solutions which can work for tidal and wave as well as wind." I very much endorse these sentiments and look forward to continuing to work with Ed Davey to deliver improved connections for our islands.
John Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Minister also update us on the interconnection capability in the Firth of Clyde, whereas he knows there's a great opportunity in terms of renewable energy harvesting?
Minister.
Well, I can give John Scott a detailed answer to that in due course, but certainly we are very much welcoming of the increased connection from Hunterston to the south, to which I think he's probably alluding. And of course, that just illustrates the truth of the matter, Presiding Officer, that contrary to what we hear sometimes from Mr Davey and others, in order to maintain security of supply in England, in order to keep the lights on in England, Scotland's electricity, which is massively in greater supply, will be required to be exported. And whereas sometimes we do feel that, metaphorically at least, the English government are in the dark, we don't actually want the English people, literally, to be in the dark.
Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Minister, were Scotland to become independent, how he would fund the interconnectors to the Northern and Western Isles? Minister.
Well, we will fund it from the very substantial resources that will be available to the people of Scotland. And of course, there are more renewable schemes in Scotland than south of the border by perhaps around about a third. But there are no nuclear power stations proposed, such as Hinkley Point, where the subsidy from the taxpayer proposed by the UK government is £35,000 million over 35 years, nor is there a bill for nuclear decommissioning of around £70,000 million. So I think we need to look at all parts of the equation, not merely those sides of the equation that suit certain political parties.
Question 9, Linda Fabiani.
To ask the Scottish Government when it will publish the findings of its review of the guidance on the administration of the Educational Maintenance Allowance.
Minister Angela Constance.
Presiding Officer, the Education Maintenance Allowance guidance documents are revised annually to give local authorities and colleges the necessary guidelines to help them administer the EMA programme effectively and fairly. The guidance documents will be issued in April 2014 and will allow local authorities and colleges to deliver the programme using their own discretion and in line with both local and national policies.
Linda Fabiani.
I would thank the Minister for that answer and ask if she is aware about the current campaign being run by the Scottish Youth Parliament, Care Fair Share for Young Carers, a component of which is the current use of the Educational Maintenance Allowance. And would she agree with me that it would be useful for her to sit round the table with those directly affected by this from the Scottish Youth Parliament to discuss the way forward?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, I'm more than happy to meet with Ms Fabiani and young carers and their representative organisations. In terms of the guidance that is currently in place, that is clear that at a local level there is the discretion for vulnerable young people that can be exercised, and in the new guidance that will be issued next month, we will indeed be crystal clear that where there needs to be flexibility with respect to vulnerable young people and young carers in particular, that message is received by our partners in colleges and local authorities loud and clear. And I would like to pay tribute to the campaign led by the Scottish Youth Parliament. We've had the opportunity to work very effectively and to ensure that where there are issues that they are indeed resolved, because this government, unlike south of the border, has retained educational maintenance allowance. It benefits nearly 35,000 young Scots, and where a young Scot is entitled to educational maintenance allowance, we want to do our utmost to ensure that they receive that benefit.
Question number 10, Graham Day.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what engagement it has had with the UK Government on defence in an independent Scotland.
Minister Keith Brown.
The Scottish Government has contacted the Ministry of Defence requesting factual information to support our consideration of the defence options that would be open to an independent Scotland. The Ministry of Defence has been unable to provide the full level of detail requested.
Briefly, Graham Day.
Thank you, Minister. The UK Defence Secretary Philip Hammond, during a recent flying visit to RM Condor and Arbroath, sniped at the detailed and costed Scottish Government plans for defence in independent Scotland. Would the Minister welcome an opportunity of a face-to-face debate with Mr Hammond on the benefits to this country's defence, which independence would bring, versus the UK Government's track record of slashing Scotland's service footprint?
Briefly, Minister.
Well, of course, I have made a public request of Philip Hammond that rather than jetting into Scotland and then scurrying back away straight afterwards without answering questions, he should stay and debate with me some of these really important issues. But it seems to be he has no awareness of any contingency plans being laid by the MOD, that he's unaware of the fact that Scottish taxpayers pay around £3.3 billion towards defence and have about £2 billion spent in return, seem to be completely unaware of the Defence Asset Register published by his own department. And it would be really important, especially as even today we're seeing complaints about cuts again in the armed forces, people being delivered with their P45s in the front line, to debate these issues in a proper and sensible way, and I would challenge him to do that in future.
Thank you, Minister. The phone going off was a cue that your time is up, but can members please make sure that all their phones are off in the chamber? Before we move to the next item of business, members